you for taking the time to join. That distracted me. Taking the time to join this afternoon and into the evening. It doesn't go unnoticed that people are here either joining live or watching at a later date because of your commitment to children and young people's emotional well-being and mental health. So thank you. I hope that it's a useful couple of hours for you. The plan is that we run from 4 o'clock until 6 o'clock. I'm going to be talking about anxiety for about an hour or so, although I haven't done a full run through of this kind of word for word, so that's approximate. And then we will go into breakout rooms with some prompt questions and come back for some discussion. There are a few interactive bits where I'll ask you to put things in the chat, if that's okay, and I'll need Jamie to let me know kind of what's in the chat because I'm looking at my notes and I can't look at both. I think that's it. So we won't take any questions kind of during the presentation just because it's being recorded, but if you do have questions, I'm more than happy to answer those a little bit later on. So welcome and thank you for joining. What I'm going to talk through today is I'm going to talk about the current context around children and young people's mental health. I'm going to talk about what is anxiety and then move on to think about how we support children and young people who are feeling anxious. And at the end of the presentation, there's some resources which hopefully you'll find helpful. So firstly, thinking about the current context and asking this question, which I think is a helpful question and hopefully you will find helpful as we go through the presentation, is are we over-medicalising distress? And I'll talk a little bit more about what that word means in a moment. Sorry, I'm not saying next slide to Jamie, which isn't very helpful. So next slide, please. So the current context, this is our current context. We know that referral rates to CAMHS have more than doubled over the past 5 years. And that's at the same time as ongoing recruitment challenges in the NHS. And we also know that there are many children and young people who need better access to appropriate services and support. So people will probably be familiar with this statistic, which is that it's now estimated that approximately 1 in 6 children have what they term here as a probable mental disorder, which is an increase from 1 in 9 in 2017. So we know that there's an increase in children presenting with emotional well-being and mental health difficulties, and we also know that there are a lot of children in need of support who perhaps aren't able to access the support that they need. So how do we understand this increase? And there are different ways of thinking about this increase. This is a quote from Professor Peter Fonagy. So he advises the government on children and young people's mental health, and he's also the chief executive of the Anna Freud Centre. He said, anxiety and low mood and unhappiness are not illnesses, they are part of life. Students are struggling and need better ways of coping, but do not have a medical problem. So on the one hand, it could be argued that we're potentially losing sight of the fact that feeling worried, feeling low or unhappy is actually part and parcel of everyday life. We're all familiar with the increase in mental health awareness campaigns. We've just recently had Mental Health Awareness Week with a focus on anxiety. And whilst these campaigns do enormously good work in lots of ways, there are some people who are cautious about the impact of these because there's a concern that what's happening is that we're increasing awareness about mental health, but we're not necessarily increasing understanding. And then we potentially create some difficulties, which include things like people self-diagnosing themselves with something that they might have heard about through a campaign. Professor Peter Fonagy also talks about the possibility that due to social media, young people are now more familiar with the diagnostic criteria for anxiety disorders. So whilst professionals continue to use the same questions that they would have used in assessments several years ago, children and young people might be answering differently to how they did several years ago. Next slide, please. Okay, but at the same time, we also know that there are a lot of environmental factors that may be or will be contributing to children and young people feeling anxious. So the cost of living crisis, academic pressures, the impact of the pandemic, social media, climate change, etc. And there's some more data here that backs that up. So 1 in 8 11 to 16-year-olds social media users reported that they've been bullied online, but this was more than 1 in 4 amongst those with a probable mental disorder. And there's also some interesting statistics here around the rates of probable mental disorder amongst children, or these are young people who have experienced not being able to buy enough food or using a food bank. So higher rates of probable mental disorder amongst those young people compared to those unlikely to have a mental disorder. So I suppose what I'm suggesting is that this isn't just a case of increased numbers of young people coming forward for support who don't need it. That's not what I'm suggesting. But we also know that there are lots of things that are happening that will be increasing the likelihood of children and young people experiencing emotional well-being and mental health difficulties. And I think it's likely that it's a bit of both. So there is increased awareness, which might perhaps lead to children and young people mistakenly thinking that they have a problem, at the same time as there are some very real pressures that children and young people are experiencing that mean that more children and young people are struggling. So something that I think is a helpful concept is the idea of over-medicalisation, because it captures both explanations for this increased prevalence. So over-medicalisation leads to some problems being inappropriately considered as illnesses, so requiring a diagnosis and treatment. So it's this idea that there are times when the strong emotions of childhood and adolescence and the associated distress is considered as an illness rather than part of everyday life. And what happens when we see this over-medicalisation is that we see an increase in referrals for mental health support, which is completely understandable, particularly given the fear and anxiety around children and young people's mental health. But there are some associated risks with this. So it leaves the everyday adults around the child or young person feeling disempowered and unable to help. It can mean that children and young people wait on long waiting lists without receiving support that might be beneficial at home or at school. It also means that the problem is potentially inaccurately located within the child or the young person, rather than considering some of the things that I've already spoken about, so the impact of social adversity or bullying, for example. And ultimately, it prevents a holistic whole system approach to support, because it creates this idea that the support that's required is something kind of separate and over there, somewhere else for somebody else to do, because it's been kind of medicalized into this idea of a diagnosis and a sort of treatment. So this is a really interesting paper that talks about how we might reduce over-medicalisation. So here they say, Ferguson et al, in 2023, they say we need a shift in the public narrative to make clear that some emotional and behavioural difficulties in young people are transient and need not be treated or labelled as mental health problems. So social anxiety, I think, is quite a good example here. A teenager who feels socially anxious is categorically different to a 35-year-old who feels socially anxious. And this is where I thought we'd just start to be a little bit more interactive. I wonder if anybody's got any ideas about why a socially anxious teenager might be something kind of different to a socially anxious 35-year-old. If anybody could pop something in the chat for that. Jamie, you'll have to let me know if anybody says anything.
Yeah, I'm on it at the moment. It's very quiet. Then just give me a heads up when you want the slide change as well.
Okay. Shall I answer my own question?
I think you may. We've got peer pressure to fit in, lack of experiences.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Development in brain.
Brilliant. Okay. So those are exactly the sorts of things that we would think about here. So developmentally, feeling anxious during your teenage years is really quite common. Being a teenager is all about identity, social situations, fitting in or not fitting in, kind of finding out where you fit. There's also something that happens in the brain during adolescence, and the reorganization in the brain that takes place during adolescence actually increases temporarily a person's valence to experience social anxiety. So the brain is actually more receptive to feeling socially anxious when you're a teenager, plus combined with all the sorts of things that we know are happening during adolescence that might be anxiety provoking in a sort of social way. So it's hopefully that helps to kind of explain some of those things around, you know, when we hear the term anxiety or the term social anxiety, we're quite often thinking about different things. The socially anxious teenager is different to a 35-year-old who feels socially anxious. And that would suggest that the support that those two individuals might need would be different. Also, what Ferguson et al. Talk about is that this isn't about dismissing distress. And I think that's a really, really important point. So when we talk about reducing over-medicalisation, we're not talking about dismissing young people's distress. We're not saying, you know, you're making a big deal out of nothing, or you're meant to feel rubbish when you're a teenager. We're validating that experience, and we're ensuring that meaningful support is available. We're not necessarily always rushing to fix some of the distress, confusion that teenagers might experience is kind of part and parcel of growing up. We don't necessarily need to rush and fix that, but provide a safe space where a young person can experience that whilst they work through it. The authors of this paper also argue really importantly for support for parents and carers. So empowering parents, there's a recognition that there's a real kind of sort of movement at the moment around lots of kind of parenting experts, parenting books. It can create the illusion that there's just kind of one way to do things. Parents potentially lose confidence in themselves and what they know about their child. So the authors of the paper are arguing for support for parents in early intervention in community-based settings where parents can access practical support. They can increase their confidence, and they can build supportive relationships with other parents and carers. They also talk about the importance of funding other community-based services, so health visitors, school nurses, family hubs, community support workers. And what they say is, in society at large, alongside raising awareness about mental health problems, we must promote and value parents and systemic non-medical solutions to young people's distress. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talk about what is anxiety. I'm sure there'll be lots in here that people will be familiar with, but it feels important to be clear about what we're talking about before we move on to thinking about how we might support children and young people who are feeling anxious. So this is probably a recap, but what is anxiety? Anxiety is a normative response designed to facilitate self-protection. So it's our body's response to threat or danger. And while it can feel really horrible and uncomfortable, it isn't actually harmful. The types of worries that children and young people experience will correlate with their age and stage of development. Anxiety is an ordinary emotion. It can actually be useful and it can enhance performance. It becomes a problem though when it's severe and or frequent and it interferes with a person's everyday life. But understanding how anxiety works can help people identify strategies to help them face their fears and overcome fears. And we know that anxiety can have an impact on different areas of life. So it can impact on social life, difficulties with friendships, becoming withdrawn. It can impact on academic performance. It can impact on mood. So it can make you feel quite low in mood if you're feeling consistently anxious. It can also result in physical complaints such as headaches, stomach aches, feeling sick, feeling tired. It can impact on sleep. Okay, so another joining in bit. I'd like you to take a look at these 3 images and the words underneath. So the first is a spider. I'd like you to imagine that you're sitting on the sofa, you look up and you spot a huge spider on the ceiling above you. I'd then like you to imagine that you're in bed the night before an important job interview. And then I'd like you to imagine that you're working on a Sunday evening before the start of a busy week. And you don't need to differentiate between each of those 3 in your responses, but if people could just drop into the chat how those images make you feel, or how those different scenarios make you feel.
Scared, tired, nervous. I mean, I don't like spiders myself, so seeing a picture of a spider straight on there, it's like instantaneous anxiety. Bad feeling in the stomach.
Nervous, fearful, exhausted, sick. Okay. I'm going to move on just in case the picture of the spider is making anybody feel genuinely sick. If you want to move on the slides, Jamie. Thank you. Okay. So hopefully what that demonstrated is that so far I've talked about anxiety, but anxiety is actually a catch-all for lots of quite different experiences. So if you're putting into words how you might feel if you saw that spider, or if you're not scared of spiders, a mouse or a tiger running towards you, you might feel frightened, scared, terrified. The night before a job interview, you might feel stressed, worried, nervous. Working on a Sunday night before a busy week, overwhelmed, stressed, tired, a bit sick. And one of the risks of over-medicalisation is that we lose the ability to understand these different experiences. So the word anxiety is really, really commonly used, but it doesn't necessarily help us to understand someone's experience, be that our own experience or a child or young person's experience. So hopefully what that really quick exercise demonstrated is that you know, actually underneath that word anxiety, there's lots of different sorts of experiences, and the experience of being really frightened, scared and terrified in the moment is quite different to that kind of rumbling, kind of overwhelmed, anxious, kind of sick feeling that you might have if you were feeling overworked, for example, and overwhelmed by workload. But anxiety has become a really, really common word. I quite often think about stage fright. So I don't think you hear that term as often as you used to. You hear performance anxiety. But just thinking about how the use of language maybe changes how we understand experiences. And then just to think about, you know, in those 3 situations, what might help in each of those situations? So would it be the same or would it be different? I don't know if people have got ideas about that, but you know, if you could imagine yourself in those situations and just drop in the chat, do you think what would help you, what you might find supportive, would be the same for each of those, or do you think it would be different?
But mine would be different. Yeah.
So for most people, the sort of different experience of kind of, different workload requires brave conversation. Yeah. Heart racing for each situation. Yeah. So that's an interesting point that, you know, the physiological sort of bodily sensations might be similar. But the support the support that's needed might look different. Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, spider could be resolved more quickly. Others need more support. Indeed. Okay. So just to think about different worries by age, people might be familiar with this sort of table, seen a table like this before, but just to reassure people that worrying is completely normal in childhood. Research suggests that approximately 70% of children kind of have worries, sort of, you know, on a sort of relatively frequent basis. And that it's a really normal part of growing up. So as a child is learning more about the world, learning more about themselves, it kind of creates these different scenarios that it would be kind of ordinary to worry about. So for example, you know, for a 0 to 2-year-old, things that might cause worry are loud noises, things that overload the senses because their senses aren't yet fully developed, people in costume, so something that's quite kind of unusual and odd that they can't quite make sense of because they haven't developed the cognitive ability yet to make sense of that. It's really ordinary for children of that age to feel anxious if they're separated from a caregiver. For 3 to 4-year-olds, we see again that it, you know, that it changes slightly. So they might find things that they see on television or read in books. They might be frightened of that sort of thing. They might be frightened of being in the dark on their own at night. Between 5 to 8, it's still very ordinary to be worried about being separated from a caregiver. Nightmares and bad dreams, monsters, ghosts, witches, and then things like thunder and lightning. Those sorts of things are typical worries at that age. Around the age of 7 to 11, some other things sort of start to emerge. So sort of that worry about being rejected or not liked or judged badly by peers. They also start to worry about something happening to themselves or people they care about. So it kind of fits with, you know, as they kind of have increased awareness, it kind of creates more things to be worried about until they've kind of learned to understand those worries in context. And at 12 plus, you can see typical worries would be what peers think of them, frightening things they might have heard about on the news, fear of missing out, somebody getting hurt, sick or dying, and then, you know, things around school, exams, failure, you know, life beyond school and what that might involve. So those are all very ordinary worries, and I think it's quite helpful to kind of have that as a bit of a frame of reference to hold in mind, to think about if you you know, have a child in front of you who's worried about something, kind of how typical is that worry. So again, as we talked about social anxiety, in a teenager or a teenager feeling socially anxious and an adult feeling socially anxious being different things. You know, a 4 or 5-year-old who's finding it difficult to separate from a caregiver at the start of the school day is different and would need a different type of support perhaps than maybe a 9-year-old who's having difficulty separating from a caregiver at the start of the school day. So most people will be familiar with the sort of the physical sensations of anxiety. So this is the physical component. It relates to the body's fight, flight and freeze response to perceived danger. So when our bodies go into that mode, whatever that mode might be triggered by, whether that's the, you know, the thought of the job interview or seeing the spider, or the kind of overwhelm of workload, we likely notice several of these physical sensations. So digestive issues, loss of appetite, grinding your teeth, tense shoulders, difficulty sleeping, etc. And those physical symptoms can be really, really unpleasant. Next slide, please. So that was the physiological component of anxiety. And then there's the cognitive component. So that's the thoughts. So for people who are familiar with CBT and kind of thoughts, feelings and behavior, this is the thoughts section. So some of those thoughts that you might have experienced in relation to those earlier images. Thoughts include kind of what ifs and potentially catastrophizing, so assuming the worst. And the thoughts are related to how we appraise the situation. So the anxiety equation that you can see here is quite a useful way to think about that. So when we're faced with an anxiety-provoking situation, we're often, but not always, and it's really important to point that out, not always, but we're often overestimating the chance of the danger and underestimating our ability to cope. And that's how we end up feeling anxious. So I expect that people will be able to think about situations that they've felt anxious about, where that's been the case. You've overestimated how bad the situation will be, and you've underestimated, you know, the resources that you have available to you to cope with the situation. And then there's the behavioural component. So that's what we do when we're feeling anxious. So we might delay, make excuses, we might avoid things, refuse to do something, might be clingy or withdrawn, might be more quiet than usual, might be asking lots of questions, might also be outbursts. And that's something that's really important to remember, is that the behaviours can look quite different for everybody, but, you know, particularly for children and young people, it might look kind of quiet and withdrawn, but it might also look like an outburst that's actually driven by feelings of anxiety. Next slide, please. Okay. So with all of that in mind, I think it can still be useful to remember that anxiety is a normal evolutionary response, and it does actually serve a helpful function. So this graph represents what happens to our bodies when we're feeling anxious and when we're in the optimum phase of worry. So it can actually be quite helpful. It can increase our motivation and help you prepare for something. So if you think, for example, it's good to feel a little bit anxious about an exam, for example, or a test, because it's that those feelings of anxiety that make sure you actually do some revision. Research has shown that students and athletes who experience some anxiety actually display improved performance on tests or while participating in competitive sports. So it can be a helpful motivator, for example, for actors feeling stage fright, as I mentioned before, and also for a job interview. However, as you can see from this curve, if there's too much anxiety, we then start to find it difficult to function, and that's when it becomes more unhelpful. I quite like this term excited anticipation that gets used quite a lot when we're thinking about, for example, children moving from primary school to secondary school. So there is perhaps that kind of, you know, some butterflies in the tummy, that kind of perhaps a little bit of nervousness, but reframing it as this idea of excited anticipation. It's just your, you know, it's your mind and your body's way of letting you know to be on alert. You're going into a new situation, you're meeting new people, there's going to be new things to learn and to take in. And so by feeling that excited anticipation, you're hopefully at that point of kind of peak performance. We also know that anxiety is really helpful as a warning sign. So, you know, if you're crossing a road and a car came at speed from around the corner, the anxiety would help you to kind of move out of the way, for example. It can also help you be more alert to your current situation and make any necessary changes. So, for example, in that the Sunday evening work stress situation. And it's the same for children. So it's really helpful if children can recognise anxiety as a bit of a warning sign, and that they might need to find ways to feel better. But what we're hoping for with children and young people is that they're in that kind of optimum range in the middle there, where they might still feel worried, which is completely normal in lots of situations, but they still feel able to cope. Okay, can anybody, before we move on to unhelpful, can anybody think of an example where anxiety has been helpful for them? Anybody drop anything into the chat?
Having a baby. It's on there.
Yeah, helps you prepare.
It's quite a good one. Start on the new
Starting-
course. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, meeting a deadline. Yeah, some of us need more anxiety than others to meet a deadline. New job. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's really helpful when we're thinking about, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but thinking about when we're talking to children and young people about anxiety, that you know, we also talk about those times when it's helpful, that you can really harness the, you know, the power of those kind of feelings of worry and put them to good use sometimes, you know, for example, to help you prepare, you're doing something for the first time. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to when anxiety is unhelpful. Okay, so we do also know, of course, that anxiety can be unhelpful. So it's unhelpful when it's experienced for long periods of time or very frequently. And that means that our body finds it, we're sort of experiencing potentially lots of sort of false alarms, and we find it difficult to switch off those false alarms. Anxiety is also a problem when it negatively impacts a person's mood and their behavior. So we've probably all had that experience of being kind of really quite worried about something. We become a bit irritable with people around us, or we respond then to situations that are actually unhelpful or make us feel worse. And we know that long-term experience of anxiety quite often coexists with things like low mood, low self-esteem, etc. And of course, it's problematic when it interferes with our day-to-day life. So for a child or young person, that could be getting to school, it could be taking part in activities, or affecting concentration or sleep. Next slide, please. So what helps, what keeps unhelpful anxiety going? So there are three things here that we know keep that unhelpful anxiety going. One of those is avoidance. So avoidance is a really common and natural response to anxiety. We'll all be familiar with having sort of engaged in avoidance activities when we're anxious about something. That's what, just basically when we avoid something that we're fearful of. And the avoidance really helps in the short term, because we potentially then don't feel the effects of our anxiety. But what it does in the long term is it ends up maintaining those feelings of anxiety, because what we don't have the opportunity to realize is that perhaps the situation wasn't going to have the outcome that we feared. And what it also means is that we don't have the chance to learn skills for coping with anxiety. So, for example, you think about a child that's afraid of dogs, they might avoid taking a particular shortcut to school through the park because they're concerned that there'll be a dog off the lead, the dog might bite the child. So the child refuses to walk through the shortcut in the park and takes a long way around instead. In the short term, the child's anxiety disappears and they feel okay. But in the long term, it maintains anxiety about dogs, because the child never gets to learn that, you know, actually, more than likely, the child will be okay taking the shortcut through the park. And that kind of instant relief that we feel when we avoid something that's making us feel anxious is reinforcing. So we basically end up in a situation where we do it again and again when we're faced with the same situation. And then secondly, reassurance seeking. So that's also another really common and natural response to anxiety. It sort of it relieves the anxiety briefly, but it also reinforces the message that there is danger to be protected from. So from a sort of adult perspective, it's really, you know, it's not unusual to want to reassure children when they're feeling anxious, but it potentially prevents children from feeling less anxious in the long run. So what we tend to find is that the more that the child receives the reassurance, they kind of continue to need that reassurance, and then they believe that they need it to be okay in that situation. And again, it prevents them from realizing that they can deal with their fears themselves, that they could test out things and realize that some of those worried thoughts that they were having were inaccurate. Again, it needs to be kind of thought about in terms of the child's age and developmental stage. You know, so you might have a child that's at bedtime scared that there's monsters in the cupboard. You know, do you go and check the cupboard with them to give them that reassurance that there's no monsters in the cupboard? Perhaps you do, depending on the age of the child, but perhaps you don't with a child of a different age or different developmental stage. And then thirdly, something that keeps unhelpful anxiety going is safety behaviours. So that might be, for example, a child wearing headphones in public because they're worried that someone might talk to them and they wouldn't know how to respond. Quite often we have, you know, adults do this too, kind of carrying water for fear of, you know, getting thirsty and then kind of passing out. The challenge with safety behaviours is that it's not really the behaviour that tells us whether or not it's a safety behaviour. So it's not like wearing headphones is a safety behaviour, carrying water is a safety behaviour. It's the function of the behaviour in the moment. And some safety behaviours are kind of actually, you know, I would kind of overlook and think, you know, lots of us will have kind of things that we do. Thinking back to the job interview, you might have a particular piece of jewelry that you wear for an interview, or you might have a particular pen that you take with you, and you sort of have this idea that you'll do okay if you take the pen with you. You know, in the long run, that doesn't necessarily do any harm, but it's in the example of the child wearing headphones in public, the reason that that's potentially problematic is that it prevents the child from testing out this worry that if someone spoke to them, they wouldn't know how to respond. So hopefully that helps a little bit to create that distinction. Next slide, please. So this is the anxiety curve, and people might be familiar with this. I think this is a really helpful image, and it relates to what I've been talking about avoiding situations. So what you see on the left-hand side is you see the level of anxiety from 0, no anxiety, all the way up to 100, so really high levels of anxiety. And then along the bottom, you can see time. So and then you see a little marker on there where, you know, whatever experience it is that potentially causes feelings of anxiety, that experience starts. And the person's anxiety is increasing and increasing in that situation that is creating feelings of anxiety. And we all do this, myself included. What happens is that we anticipate that our anxiety will just keep going and going and going and going to this kind of catastrophic point. And so what we do is the avoidance is that we take this kind of escape route. So we get ourselves out of that situation, and our anxiety comes right back down, and we think, okay, good, you know, and we've got our short-term relief from anxiety. But what we then don't get to learn is that anxiety does reduce naturally on its own. And that process is called habituation. So it means kind of getting used to a situation or an experience. So, you know, I suppose kind of giving a presentation is quite a good example of that. So for most people will feel some anxiety before they do a presentation. That anxiety will kind of build and build, and then once you've been in that situation for a while, actually the feeling of anxiety does sort of start to tail off. But if we don't stay in that situation and we just kind of leave after 2 minutes, we don't have the chance to realize that we actually habituate to that. We get used to that experience and we're actually okay. So it does drop naturally over time. So what we try to do is, instead of avoiding things, we know that it's more helpful to face the situations that we fear in a gradual way. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So this is a vicious cycle of anxiety. So you can see that there's the feelings of anxiety, there's the avoidance, and then there's that short-term relief and that reinforcement, and then it keeps going. And so what we're trying to do when we're addressing anxiety, whether it's our own or anyone else's, is trying to break that cycle. Okay. So what causes anxiety? A question that you know, we often think about. We know that there's lots of different contributing factors to anxiety. So we know that there are evolutionary factors. So this idea of fight, flight, and freeze, which would have been adaptive for us a long time ago, when that kind of fight, flight, or freeze was activated. It would mean that we would either fight something, flee something, or freeze to keep safe from being attacked or eaten. We know that there are also biological factors. So we're all born with a particular genetic makeup, different temperaments, different personalities. Some people are just more sensitive to feeling anxious, or have particular temperaments that can make you potentially more vulnerable to experiencing problematic anxiety. We know that problematic anxiety can be triggered after a traumatic event, and that traumatic life events can lead to people having kind of more sensitive threat systems, so being more hypervigilant to kind of any kind of threat, and perhaps finding it more difficult to distinguish between, you know, a very kind of real threat, which might be the kind of tiger chasing you down the road, to something that's actually not dangerous. We also know that we learn from others. So we learn how to respond in different situations from those around us. So, you know, if a trusted adult is anxious, for example, about dogs, then a child might learn from that person that dogs aren't safe. Even if that person isn't explicitly giving that message, they might be picking up on kind of non-verbal language around dogs, such as crossing over the road when a dog's coming on their side of the road. And also, as I've touched on, if trusted adults don't support children to feel safe in situations, so perhaps they're encouraging that avoidance, or they're not supporting to help increase confidence in coping skills, those things are things that we can kind of learn from others. We learn kind of as a child or young person, like, how able am I to deal with this? Do you think I've got this? Do you think I can manage this? And they'll pick up on messages from others about that. And of course, you know, what we see and hear around us. So for example, in the news. It's also really important to remember about environmental factors. So we know that there are children and young people that are living in situations that are genuinely anxiety provoking. So that could be parental conflict, for example, that could be bullying, that could be financial worries. Okay. Just thinking about neurodiversity and anxiety. So these are some of the reasons why children who might be neurodivergent might be more likely to experience anxiety. So we know change and uncertainty, for example. So if children prefer routine and they like to know what's happening in advance, they might find it difficult kind of coping with change and uncertainty. And some of the things that some children might take in their stride as a change, other children either due to neurodivergence or, you know, some other reason that might be more significant for another child. But that kind of change and uncertainty can certainly increase feelings of anxiety. Sensory experiences. So we know that some children have a heightened or a reduced response to sensory experiences. So children might find that they're feeling anxious if they can't kind of access a particular kind of sensory experience that they like, or they might feel overwhelmed by a particular sensory experience. So kind of smells and tastes in the canteen at school is quite a good example. Sights and sounds of the playground. It's also really important to remember that anxiety then might be caused by something that's not visible to others. And then that kind of causes more anxiety because the child or young person might not be getting the support that they need. So you might have a young person who appears anxious in a maths class. That might be because they find maths particularly challenging and they're worried about not doing well in maths, or it might be that there's a flickering light in that particular room that they're finding overwhelming in a sensory way. Social and emotional understanding of self. So quite often what we know about, for example, autistic children is that they might feel the physical sensations in relation to a feared situation, but they might not necessarily know what that means or why it's happening. They might find it difficult to put into words. They might also struggle with those uncomfortable feelings and then struggle to make a plan to make it feel better. They might express those feelings through a behavior that might mean that it's not recognized as anxiety, and then they might be slower to get support. We also know that social and emotional understanding of others can have an impact. So, taking that example of feeling anxious in social situations that we talked about earlier, it's very different for, a 15-year-old feeling socially anxious because they kind of go in and they think, oh, everybody's looking at me and I don't know if I fit in, or whatever it might be, is different to a young person who's worried that they're not sure they know what other people are feeling or thinking, or that that they can manage a social situation. Can also experience frustration in those sorts of situations. Difficulties with planning and problem solving. So the school environment can be more anxiety provoking for a child that has difficulties with planning, problem solving, organising themselves, concentration. Exacerbates those worries about doing well or getting told off. And of course, feeling different can lead to feelings of anxiety in the same way as the things that we know are experienced by neurodivergent children and young people. So stigma, discrimination, bullying can all lead to feeling anxious. Okay, so we're on to the final section, thinking about how can schools support children and young people who are feeling anxious. So with all of that in mind, just to go briefly back to thinking about the context, this is from a recent report by Education Support called Teaching the New Reality. And it demonstrates the enormous amount of pressure that I believe education staff are under. So it's not just about the emotional support that is needed by children and young people in schools, but also the needs of staff themselves. And what else do we know? Well, we know that according to this research in 2022, school staff feel inadequately trained to identify and support young people with mental health problems. They're concerned about missing cases of significant distress and disorder, and concerned about making a potential mental health difficulty worse. And I think that links us back to what I spoke about at the beginning about those risks of over-medicalisation, because by over-medicalising, we create this idea that it's kind of something else that perhaps somebody else needs to deal with. It's something that we could get wrong. So as the proverb says, it takes a whole village to raise a child. I really want to emphasize here as I go through these suggestions of how to support in school, that I really see school as being part of the system that can support a child or young person, meaning that we all need to work together. So next slide, please, Jamie. Families, communities, schools and services. And indeed, that's what we're trying to do with the emotional wellbeing teams in Kent and the emotional support teams in Medway. We're trying to find a way to support children and young people in the most appropriate way possible. So that might be through individual or group work. It might be through psychoeducation for parents and carers, or it might be through consultation to staff in schools, might be through signposting. But this idea that emotional wellbeing and mental health is everyone's business, but that means everyone, not just teachers, but everybody working together. So supporting children and young people with anxiety, I'm going to talk through those. The first thing is really thinking about the language that we use. So supporting children and young people to describe their feelings using a range of vocabulary. So some of the vocabulary that we spoke about at the beginning, to really get an understanding of an experience rather than this kind of anxiety kind of blanket term. And I also think it's really helpful to make this distinction between saying I have anxiety and I feel anxious, because I think when we say I feel anxious, it allows us to think that it is something that's temporary, something fleeting, something that we might not feel in 10 minutes time or the next day. Whereas when we say I have anxiety, I think it can sound much more like a fixed state, something permanent and a disorder. So even that subtle shift in language, I think, can help. So with that kind of understanding, validating and normalizing, as I said before, this idea of over medicalization doesn't at all mean not validating how children and young people are feeling. It actually means really validating it so that children and young people feel that their experiences are understood without necessarily needing a diagnosis for that validation. It's about being prepared to normalize and hold space for those feelings of emotional discomfort, which are part and parcel of childhood, adolescence, adult life. And supporting children to understand that more often than not, those difficult feelings will come and go. As part of that, resilience conversations, which you can find out more about on the Kent Resilience Hub, if you'd like to, if you're not familiar with those. But these 6 areas in our lives where we can promote resilience, so feeling secure, friendships, talents and interests, education, emotions, behaviours and health. So this idea that you know, through a resilience conversation, there's actually a lot of support that a young person can access that might not be a kind of, you know, kind of medicalized type of support. I really believe that, you know, through children and young people having experiences where they might be able to kind of overcome a challenge, even if that's a kind of, you know, a kind of sporting challenge or, you know, trying something new, those feelings of kind of being able to overcome something or go into a situation that makes you feel a bit worried, children can then kind of take what they've learned from that and apply it to another situation where they're feeling anxious. Another way to support children and young people is to promote these have a go behaviours. So people would probably be familiar with that term, but that's a way of testing out worries about a particular situation. As part of this, I think it's helpful to think about how adaptations are used in school. So things like exit cards, special exam arrangements, permission not to take part in public speaking activities. These temporary adaptations definitely have a time and a place, but we would always advocate that they're reviewed at agreed time points and that some positive risk taking is supported. And just thinking about, you know, quite often when we think about anxiety, because it's experienced by the individual, we quite often think of the solutions as being very individual focused solutions. So you might have noticed that with, you know, particular kind of mental health awareness campaigns where, you know, they talk about, oh, the solution is self-care, or the solution is, you know, have bath, or you know, get more exercise. But I think it's also really important that we're thinking about the interventions that might take place in the immediate environment around somebody. So the importance of things like physically accessible spaces, anti-discriminatory practice, access to being part of important communities, having appropriate expectations, having emotionally safe attachment figures, sensory safety, etc. So from a sort of school perspective, it's thinking about supporting the individual sort of directly, perhaps with some of those have a go behaviours and some of the conversations, but also thinking about what can you do in the environment around somebody. This is an example of graded exposure. So people might be familiar with this as kind of a ladder of how you gradually face fear, which I think is just a helpful kind of reference. This is quite some of the ones you see aren't necessarily very clear, but I think this is a really good example of a very, very kind of gradual way of working towards a goal, which is swimming in a pool at a friend's birthday party. And the other thing that I really like about this example is that I'm going to assume that that goal is something that the child or young person chose for themselves, that they really wanted to be able to do. So they're motivated to work towards each step on the rung of the ladder. So when we're thinking about those have a go behaviors, we might be thinking about, where is somebody on the ladder towards, what it is that they're hoping to do, and what might be that next little step rather than what's the big jump, kind of jumping in the deep end and splashing around with your friends. I think it's common to wonder about when it's appropriate for a child or young person to be excused from a particular activity, or for there to be adaptations in place. So as I've just spoken about, making sure that those adaptations are regularly reviewed. And I'm sharing this diagram because I think it's helpful for understanding that. So this idea, similar to the curve that you saw before, the idea is that anxiety increases over time, but actually each time you go into the feared situation or face the fear reduces more quickly. So if we're thinking about whether or not some of these things, like doing something in gradual steps, is appropriate, it's important to remember that this only works if the fear is based on something that's either very unlikely to happen. So, walking through the shortcut in the park, it is possible that there could be a dog that would be off the lead and might bite the child, but we work on the basis that it is very unlikely. Or we work on the basis that the feared outcome actually won't be as bad. It'll be survivable. It won't be as bad as anticipated. So we know then that in those situations, rather than avoiding them, it's helpful to face the fearful situations in a gradual way. But it's not appropriate where the fear is based in a reality. So this approach is about a perceived threat, not an actual threat. So if we think back to when I was talking about neurodivergence, an autistic child who finds the noise in the dining room overwhelming, or an autistic child who's worried about social situations because of a fear of misunderstanding social cues, this wouldn't be an appropriate approach, because no amount of kind of repeated exposure to that situation is going to stop the noise in the dining room being overwhelming. That's when you would be thinking about a couple of slides back, the kind of environmental adaptations that you might make to reduce anxiety in that situation, or supporting the child around social situations. Okay. So of course, as everyday adults, be that as teachers or as parents and carers, it can be really difficult to see a child or young person who's distressed, and our instinct is more, often than not, to try and make everything better, and that's, absolutely to be expected. But some of the things that we might do to make everything better might actually keep the problem going. So it doesn't give the child a chance to face fear and see that they'll be okay. And we might inadvertently give a message that we don't think the child can do it, or it is genuinely something to be feared. I'm hoping that what we've spoken about today will support you in having conversations with children and young people about worries and fears, helping them understand how they're feeling, to work out whether the worry is realistic, what are the chances that it will happen, do they have the necessary tools to deal with the situation, making sure that adjustments are reviewed regularly, encouraging the facing of fears in small manageable steps, also really ensuring that children and young people feel understood and that we're not dismissing their worries. So something that might feel really quite insignificant to us, if a child is behaving in a way that is really significant to them, then, more than likely it is really significant. So this is just to remind us of that whole system approach. So people will be familiar with whole school approach, You know, there are things that we can do at the individual level with the individual child or young person, but it's also important that we think about the environment around the child or young person. You know, so is it a reasonable expectation that the child who finds a particular situation overwhelming because of the sensory experience, you know, actually perhaps we don't do something on the individual level, we do something in the environment. Also thinking about interventions in the relationships around a person and how important that is, and things that probably feel out of our control but are equally important, I think, to name today. Changes in the social structures around people, and as I've touched on at the beginning, changes in wider societal narratives about emotional well-being and mental health. So what I've hoped to do today is sort of highlight that you know, there is lots that all of us can do to support children and young people with anxiety. Finally, looking after yourself. So I know this does feel a bit cliched because it is easier said than done, and we all know fit your own oxygen mask first, you can't pour from an empty cup, etc. But looking after yourself is really important. There's a link here to Self-Care Summer, which is from Education Support. There's a nice booklet and poster. And the three things that they highlight in there are prioritizing rest, reviewing boundaries, and building healthy habits for the academic year. So what I thought we'd do just before we go into breakout rooms is share something in the chat that has worked for you in terms of self-care. See if we can inspire others. Jamie, I don't know, maybe I can type. I risk losing my slides at this point. I'm going to put mine in.
Couch to 5K. We got, oh, that's you, Couch to 5K. Yeah,
that's me.
Yeah, being out with nature, meeting friends, working out, mountain biking, swimming, reading, technology detox. Good one. Regular supervision with a qualified counsellor, talking to friends, meditation, hobbies, home and work-life balance, gardening, going for a walk by the beach, accepting that I can't do everything, and being kind to myself. Pets, yeah, pets are a big one. Being in the sun, taking regular walks, a good bath, floating before leaving work. Lovely.
Good. So yeah, although it's said all the time, it is really true that, you know, in order to be able to sit with a child who's feeling anxious or worried or distressed, to be able to, you know, to validate their experience when it might seem quite insignificant or minor, it's much easier to do that when we're feeling well in ourselves. And I say that as a clinical psychologist and as a parent, that there can be a, you know, a bit of a like, oh, just, you know, get on with it, it's not so bad. Yeah, that's not necessarily helpful. I don't know, I was going to ask what people's take-home messages were from the presentation that I've just done, but I don't know whether we might cover that in the breakout rooms.
Yeah, I
Jamie.
thought if we do
People
that in
probably need
breakout
a bit
rooms.
of a break, and then the remainder of the slides are all just resources, which maybe I'll just run through at the end, actually, just to talk to those. But I think maybe time for breakout rooms.
Yeah, so do we want to, should we just give people a 5-minute break?
Yeah.
And then if people come back in, say, 5:10, and just after 5:10, 5:11, and then we'll put you into breakout rooms. I'll just give you a couple of questions, discussion, and then you can come back for Virginia with a few questions based around this and obviously your own experiences as well.
Yeah, okay. And if anybody is feeling like sneaking off and you've got anything you want to drop in the chat before you go about take-home messages, then please do feel free to do that. No judgment. Not that I'm encouraging you to go. I'm just... you still recording, Jamie?
Well done. Well reminded.